Hello everybody, and oh, did I wake you up, Steinbeck? I'm sorry. Go back to sleep. Hello everybody. In today's video we're going to talk about time lapses. And this is a video that I've been wanting to make for a long time. Literally since the first week that I made this channel 7 years ago, almost 8 years ago. When I sat down and I made this channel in 2013, I came up with a list of about a dozen topics of things that I wanted to make videos about. 9 of them were things I didn't know enough about to make videos at the time. So, and I didn't have enough content to make those videos. So over the years, I've been winnowing away at that list, or I was until I lost it. But I do remember that this is one of the first things that I came up with. So we're going to talk about how to make time lapses today. And this right here is the most basic time lapse kit that you need. Tripod, camera, and lens. The rest of this process is functionally gear agnostic. Doesn't matter what brand, what focal length, none of that matters. You need to have a tripod that will keep your camera steady. You need to have a camera with either a built-in intervalometer, or you need to have an external intervalometer that you can plug into it, or you need to have way more patience than God gave me to sit there and take a picture on schedule every time you need it to be taken for however many hours that your time lapse is going to take. And then you need to have a lens. In this video, you're going to see time lapses that were taken on a 31mm lens and 35mm lens, 15, a 14, and a 10mm lens, and I think maybe a 100mm lens as well. APS-C, full frame, things like that. So a time lapse can be really simple. It can be a pepper plant in the sun. It can be a very complex set of Photoshop actions to create a Milky Way time lapse off of a separate foreground and Milky Way exposures. Yeah, and I'm going to show you how to do that, by the way, including I'm going to show you how I wrote the Photoshop actions required to make those time lapses. But the first, it can also be cloud trails and things like that. First thing we're going to do is talk about how to make a time lapse. Before you do anything with your camera, you've got to plan it. Planning is the most important part of this. Now, how long do you want your time lapse to be? So you want your time lapse to be 10 seconds. That's a very short time lapse, by the way. 30 frames per second, 10 seconds, that's 300 frames. So a 10-second time lapse is going to be 300 exposures. 12 seconds, 360. If you want it to be 100 seconds, just shy of 2 minutes, you're going to need 3,000 exposures. That's a lot. So at any rate, first you need to do is plan out how long it's going to be, and then from there figure out how many frames you're going to need. Okay, are you going to be doing something where you're taking a photo every 30 seconds? If you need 300, and let's say you're making a 10-second time lapse, you need 300 frames taken one every 30 seconds. That's, I need my calculator now. All right, 300 frames times 30 seconds is 9,000 seconds of time, which is 150 minutes, just shy of 3 hours. So if you're going to take a photo every 30 seconds, you need about 3 hours of time. And that's in the example of a Milky Way shot. Every one of the Milky Way shots, you're going to see the Milky Way portion of it is 30 seconds. It's a 30-second exposure. So 30, 30, 30 for about 3 hours to get that 12-second time lapse. So the planning portion of it is location, time needed, number of frames needed, having enough batteries for it. That's the only thing that ever cuts off my Milky Way time lapses is running out of batteries. And having the space for it. And then from that, you pick out your gear. You need a lens that can do manual focus, which is all or almost all of them. A camera that you can set and forget. What you want to be able to do is set up the intervalometer in your camera so that you can say, take a picture at this interval until the batteries die or the memory card runs out. Or if you have it plugged into a wall, set the number of exposures and that to give you the number of photos that you need. You need to also be able to use manual exposure with your camera. The reason is that if you have automatic exposure and your lighting changes, then you're going to get a flickering. And that's what happened with this Ferris wheel time lapse. I was using aperture priority shooting, and it was because the lights on the Ferris wheel kept changing, the meter reading kept changing on the camera, and that caused a flickering in the time lapse. Then the drawback to manual exposure is means you need to have control of your lighting. In this example with the pepper plant, what happened was I had manual exposure and I had the idea of tracking the pepper plant in the light over the course of the day. As clouds moved in and out, as the position of the sun changed, it affected the light on the pepper plant, which resulted in the pepper plant's illumination changing over the course of the day. So you need to be able to also control your lighting if you're doing something like this during the day. If you're doing one of these at night with the Milky Way, your lighting's not going to fundamentally change unless the moon rises. So you've got a little bit more forgiveness when it comes to doing things like that. All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts of how we're going to set up a time lapse. First is you got to be in manual focus mode. You don't want to have your time lapse shifting focus. Okay, that done. Next, we're going to have to set up the intervalometer. This is a Pentax K1. It's got a built-in intervalometer. But like I said, if you don't have one built into your camera, you either need to get an external one or be very patient with the shutter release. So once you have set your camera to manual focus, then you need to set up the aperture. The best way to do it is with manual exposure. However, if you're not going to use manual, there's another option, which is you can go into an automatic exposure mode like aperture priority or program, and then set the auto exposure lock, symbolized here by the asterisk. And I believe every camera maker uses the asterisk. That's a completely viable alternative to full manual shooting. After that, what you need to do, that's the technical side of it. Then it's just a matter of composition, and that's what is up to you. How are you going to compose this image so that it looks the way that you want it to look? Okay. So what if you don't have the exact composition that you want? What if you want to create a composition? Let's go take a look at some Photoshop actions. All right, first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start here in the raw editor with a foreground image. Now what I'm going to show you how to do is the basics of creating a foreground mask. This is going to allow you to use a different time-lapse image as your background with a more interesting foreground. This is especially useful with Milky Way photography. I've taken this foreground of a lodge that we stayed at a few weeks ago and cropped out all of the nonsense parking lot. We don't need that. There was a lot of heavy foreground in this because I wanted all of the verticals in the building to be correct. And I knew I didn't need a ton of sky because I was going to cut all that out anyway. So go into the raw editor, we're going to punch up the exposure so that we can see the sky separated from the foreground easily, copy that image and create one that is normally exposed. Now we're going to put both of those into the same file in different layers. I did it this way to ensure that the cropping on both of them was the same, and that just made it a little bit easier. Next, we're going to go in and we're going to mask out in really, really rough terms the outline of the building. And we're going to do this roughly because we're going to come back and we're going to refine it in a little bit to make it a little bit more realistic. And I'm just doing this quick and dirty for the video, by the way, so it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a few elements that are cut out, and it also is going to kind of look pasted in. I think that with the actual real sample that I created for this of the Trapper's Lake montages or time lapses, composites, that it looks a little bit better. Okay, so now that we've got everything masked off, what we need to do is come here to the layer that we're actually going to use, delete everything that we're not actually going to use. There we go. Now we have a foreground object that we can use in front of our backgrounds. Now let's drop one frame from our background into the foreground and see how it's going to line up. Oh, this was a mistake. I needed to do something else first. We needed to expand the canvas because we want to have the image that we're going to drop in be the exact same width as the image that we're actually working with here. So let's get rid of that layer that we dropped in by accident. Let's drop this layer in again. And just wanted to show you the kinds of mistakes that are easy to make and ways to rectify them. Now knowing that we have a background which is the correct dimension, we can drop this in. Everything fits generally smoothly. That looks kind of like it should. It's not good, but it gives you the idea. We've got these trees over here. We don't necessarily want those trees in here. What we're going to do is we're going to expand. Nope, we're going to rotate it. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to drop this over to the side. There we go. Now you can see the trees that were on the side have now kind of disappeared. And that disappearing, it's because they're behind the foreground layer. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to crop this image down to the size of the background with the foreground in front of it. Now, this is going to be the final size and shape of the image. What we need to do is make the image, the foreground, we need to have it so it's going to properly line up when we run our script. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the canvas and we're going to set the canvas size. And I'm going to use the calculator tool here because this is a really good way to remember the canvas size. We can now see the numbers up there. It also tells us how many megapixels the image is going to be if you need to plan that for the size of image that you're going to make or the size of time-lapse video. Now that we've gotten rid of the background because we don't need it for the timing, let's zoom in all the way. 3200% is what I can do here in Photoshop. And we're going to put a single pixel in the top left corner that's black. The reason we're going to do that is because everything we're going to do for positioning the background layers is going to be linked to the top left corner, and having this pixel here in the foreground will be completely unnoticeable, and it will make it very simple for us to do all of our linking, or all of our placing rather, in the top left. Now save this as a PNG file because that's going to give you a transparent background, and that's what we need to have to drop the background image in place. Here's how I recorded the action for the Trapper's Lake foreground. And basically, I made a few mistakes in here and we'll run through them. The first thing I did was I opened up a background image. And I'm now going to, as you can see, I'm recording the action over here on the side, by the way. I'm now going to resize the canvas. So I opened the file in RAW. I'm resizing the canvas for the image size that I need it to be. And as you can see here, the canvas resizing is linked to the top left corner, which is why we put that 1 pixel in the top left corner of our mask. This is a different foreground we're going to use, but the process is exactly the same. Next, we're going to drop in the foreground PNG, and now it's lined up properly because of that top left pixel. The foreground anchors to the top left. The background anchors to the top left. For some reason, there's this one single line of pixel on the left. I don't understand why that appeared. It shouldn't have. I probably placed the top left pixel incorrectly. Anyway, we'll just make cropping that line out part of the action. Next thing we need to do is mask the foreground because, as you can see, dropping the background in looks kind of unnatural like this. I want the Milky Way reflecting off of the lake. That was my vision when I decided to create this time lapse. So I'm going to duplicate the background layer and then reflect it onto the lake. And I don't need it to reflect the exact same way because if I did, it wouldn't look natural. So I'm going to take the sky and reflect it at a different aspect ratio with some compression compared to real because that will make it look like it's actually receding on the lake. Now I'm going to mask out the areas around the water. So what I'm actually going to do is go through here and mask the water itself, and then I'm going to select the inverse, feather, and delete everything from the sky that is not over the water. This can be rough at this point because we're not going to be using these hard lines in this mask as the final layout. We're going to come through and we're going to fine tune this to make it look natural, because if you just did it here this way, it would not look natural. And I have just screwed up. You know what I did? I forgot to add the part of the lake behind the little waterfall to the mask. And so I'm going to have to go back and add that, pause the recording. If you make a mistake when you're recording an action, that's fine. What you do is you pause the recording, and then you delete those actions, and then you go into your history in Photoshop, and you delete or you undo what you just did. And here you can see what happens when I made the mistake of not masking out the lake portion. The sky just ends at the waterfall. That does not look natural. So we'll go back, we'll change some of the action items here, we'll take a few steps back in the history, and now I will add the lake portion beyond that little tiny waterfall to the mask. And that's going to give us the natural look that we're going for. Go a little bit outside of the boundary of what you're working on, because you can always work inward. You can never work, you can work outward with the history brush, but we're making this as simple as possible for people who are learning how to use this. This is what it looks like now. We've got the whole sky over the water. That's good. We've feathered it, but still that feathering doesn't look natural. So what we're going to do is we're recording the macro, or the action again rather. We're going to come in and we're going to do some manual erasing. And your eraser tool settings are going to be up to you. I'm using a small one here. I think I'm using 70% transparency or 70% pressure on the eraser, because I want the boundary of the erased area to blend into what's around it. So I did the waterfall first, then I gave myself a slightly larger eraser, and I'm going in and just going right over the edges of it. Things that will make this look fake are stars moving over your bushes or over the mountains. So stars moving in the water will make it look real. So make sure that you are really good about getting rid of everything that's over land objects. Now I'm going to blend in the edges here so that they sort of gently bleed into the reflection of the plants on the water. Now that will make it look like the stars shining through the plant leaves are sort of making it, and that's going to give us a natural transition as the stars move over the water. And that's what we want. This whole process is about making a created scene look natural by blending the composite edges of the different layers. So we'll go through here, and once we have blended these composite layers, now just having the stars over the water, that doesn't look natural. It looks literally like we just plunked the stars into the water and did some erasing, and that's going to really stand out as fake looking if we make the video just with the layer looking like this. So we're going to have to mess with the transparency and the blending. For whatever reason, the action that I was working with would not recognize blending layers. I wanted to use soft light because that looked really good, but the action wouldn't record that. So I just changed the transparency with normal blending to 42%, and that was pretty close to the look that I wanted, and it was successful. The action saved that. So now what I'm going to do is, having saved the action, I'm going to run it. And I'm just going to let the action go and record all of the photos and run the action on all of the photos from the shoot. Now I found with this action that it worked best if I used automate and batch with Photoshop instead of using the image processing function. For whatever reason, the image processor would not work with this action. So automating it and then setting my automation settings so that the files would all open and then resave gave me a successful automated run. And then it's just a matter of letting your computer go and do its thing. If you have 2,000 or 3,000 photos, your best bet's to create this action and then set it up to run overnight and come back and check on it in the morning. But one thing you want to do before you run it for real is grab 4 or 5 of your images that you're going to use in this, and then drop them into the folder and do a test run on your action with 4 or 5 images. Because that way, if it messes up, you just have to wait for it to run a few images. You don't have to go through and do a Control-Alt-Delete. You also want to close Photoshop before you run it, because when you close Photoshop, that saves your action. If you have to Control-Alt-Delete Photoshop, or if it crashes before you close it, you're going to lose your recorded action. So those are a couple of things I learned the hard way doing this. And once you have done a successful test run and seen that your action works, then run it on your entire time lapse. And this is a good way that you can create time lapses that look the way you want them to, frame by frame, without having to manually do every single frame of the time lapse. Can you imagine masking off every one of these frames and blending them all so that they all looked exactly the same? That would be impossible. All right, so we've run the action. We have all of our images in place that are what we want them to look like. The action was successful. We've got all of our frames. The next thing we need to do is drop them into a video editor. You can do this in Photoshop, but I find a video editor is just a little bit easier to work with. I use Movie Studio 17 Platinum, and it's really easy to do this with Platinum. We're going to go into Options and Preferences, and there are different settings for different movie makers that functionally are the same. We're going to make sure that the new still image length in seconds is 0.035. That's one frame at 29.97 FPS. Okay, great. This is what we want. The default for this is 5 seconds. And by the way, if you use this program and you make this change after you do your time lapse, come back in here and change your setting back to 5 seconds, because one frame at a time is really kind of a pain to edit. So at any rate, we've got all of our frames here. There are 257. Is that correct? 253. 253 frames divided by 29.97 this is going to give us an 8.5 second time lapse. Going to come in here to video, and we're going to drop all of these in here. And the preview is going to give us a rough preview of what this looks like. Well, my computer's struggling a little bit with 253 52 megapixel files. That's a lot of data to ask it to process. And so this is how you enter every individual frame into your video maker for a time lapse. You can see here, this is kind of what this is this video. What we're looking at right now is this video being made. And you can see all of the different files that are in my project's media space for this one video. That's a lot of data. And it's just a matter of dropping these things in so that you can set them up to work. And let's take a look at what these different time lapses look like as finished products. We're going to take a look at every time lapse I've made for this video, and I hope that you enjoy them. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.